Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today I'm going to break down the most common issues with world building that I see in unpublished manuscripts and sometimes in published manuscripts, but we're not going to talk about that. So these are mistakes that kind of hurt believability, that maybe just are factual issues, things that don't really make scientific or technical sense. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about science because I am not a scientist, but I am going to just sort of let you know the basic kind of things that you might want to look out for. With these world building mistakes, I'm going to break them down into categories and just sort of talk about issues that I see frequently that you might want to try to avoid. So with religion, the most common problem that I see is that there's an invented religion, one that you completely make up for your story, but it follows a little bit too closely to Christian tradition. And I'm not talking about the beliefs themselves that are a part of the religion, but the cultural or the religious traditional practices. So, for example, celebrating Christian holidays like Christmas, or having services on Sunday, or having communion, things that there isn't necessarily a basis for if the Bible doesn't exist, if the religious traditions don't exist, if they don't have that religious heritage in your world, if there's no connection to our world and to Christianity. The other common problem that I see with religion is that there's only one religion and everybody believes exactly the same thing. This isn't very realistic, so make sure that you're not overly homogenizing people, because there is not a lot of circumstances where everybody would believe exactly the same thing. So the most common problem I see with education is characters who jump into a career or start working in an occupation that would naturally require a lot of education, but they just don't have any. So for example, maybe they become a potion maker or an alchemist or a hacker, or maybe they build computers and they don't have any experience that would go into it. So it just seems unrealistic. So make sure that your characters have an apprenticeship or they've had some kind of education. Another issue that I sometimes see with education are schools that teach magical skills, but it's not clear how they're intended to put those skills into action. In other words, it's not clear what occupations they're being prepared for or what they're going to do when they leave school. And this sometimes also happens in dystopian or sci-fi books where everybody is being trained to work in technology, or maybe everybody is being trained to fight, but it's not clear what they're going to do when they leave or what those skills are going to be applied towards. The most common issue with the history of the world is just that there is no history, that there's no sense of how the world got to this particular point. With dystopian, that can be particularly problematic if you're not really giving a clear explanation for how things got to this point, for how things got so strange and so potentially terrible as in a dystopian. So for example, if everybody is on some kind of drug to keep them under control, why was that the decision that was made? Why was this necessary? In what way were the people previously out of control? What made this become the standard? If you have child soldiers, why are the children fighting? Why aren't the adults fighting? Why didn't anybody fight against this? How did this come to be? I always wonder those things when I read. I'm always thinking, how did this come about? And if I don't get a satisfactory explanation, it can really make it hard to stay engaged and to believe in the world. With medical problems, the biggest problem that I tend to see is that there's inconsistency in what can and can't be healed. So someone will break their arm and there'll be some gadget or some spell that'll immediately heal it. But then later on, somebody will crack their skull and there's no way to heal it and they die or they become unconscious. This tends to come across like you're cheating a little bit because you don't want to deal with the consequences of the broken leg, but you do want somebody later to be able to die of a cracked skull. But really consider whether you're being truly consistent and that will help to avoid issues with the reader not being able to suspend disbelief. So there are several different issues with food that I see come up. One is that a dish is invented, it's given a name, it may be even described what it's made out of, but you're not giving the reader a sense of what it tastes like. The reader really likes to understand what the food tastes like. It also helps to understand if something is comfort food, if it's really sweet, if it's spicy, because those have different kinds of connotations and they set different kinds of moods for the scene. Another common problem with food is that the meat is chicken or beef, but there aren't chickens or cows in the world you've created, especially if you just happen to not have mentioned any actual real world animals. It can come across as really strange when all of a sudden they're eating a slab of beef and you're kind of wondering, where did this cow come from? If you only previously introduced fantastical animals into the story, it can just be a little bit jarring. The last problem that I sometimes see with food is that all of the cultures or the different creatures eat basically the same thing. If you have different races or different creatures or different humanoids, they all probably have their own cuisine, different types of things that they eat, and that may be locationally specific, it may be culturally specific, but orcs and warlocks probably don't eat the same things. The main issue I see with technology is that something is invented, but it isn't evenly applied to all situations. When we invent something, we try to apply it to as many different situations as possible, to use it as widely as possible. And so if you invent something in your world and it's only applied to one specific situation, it can seem a little bit unusual. For example, if you have hydro-powered cars, but you're still burning coal, you'll need some kind of explanation for why that is. Why is the hydropower not used everywhere? If you have teleporters and you also have airplanes, you'll need to explain why. Why do the airplanes need to exist? If people are taking phone calls with holograms and then you have video games that are just handheld controllers and flat screens, it just comes across as a little bit odd because the hologram technology would be applied to that situation as well. With slang or colloquialisms, the most common problem is just that it doesn't make sense in the context of the world you've created. Avoiding real-world slang and colloquialisms entirely isn't really possible, but I do recommend that you avoid using phrases that are very obviously not relevant to your world or to your society. For example, if you've completely invented a world, something like "don't let the bed bugs bite" could be really jarring because bed bugs probably don't exist in your world, so that phrase wouldn't exist in your world. The most common problem I see with the climate or the weather is that it just isn't explained. There's just no details about what the seasons are like or what the weather is like. It's not clear if this is a cold environment or a hot environment or if the seasons have a lot of variation, and that information can help to make the world a little bit more realistic. Another problem that I see is that a world will be described as having like 6 suns and 5 moons, and there's no explanation of how that affects the weather and no explanation of how it affects the length of the day. So make sure that you do some research into that and that you understand what effects that will have so it will seem more realistic. The most common issue I see with creatures or races is that they all act the same, they all have the same morality, and they all have the same personality. This can come across as very unrealistic. It is not natural for all people of a certain culture or a certain race to act exactly the same. So if all elves are pretty and sweet and graceful and all orcs are mean and angry and Hulk-like creatures, it just doesn't seem very realistic. It also has the problem of relying on tropes, so that isn't desirable either. So make sure if you have different races or different creatures that you're not relying on some simple formula so that they're all basically the same. They should still all have their own distinct personalities. The most common issue I see with creatures is that only magical or mystical type of creatures are introduced, or only real world creatures are introduced, but then the other kind of creature is introduced later on. This can be really jarring. So I recommend that you introduce, if both exist, that you introduce both early on. It's very awkward if you've only described mystical kinds of things, unicorns and griffins, and then all of a sudden somebody has a pet dog or somebody is eating a chicken breast. It comes across as very strange and jarring. So make sure that you introduce both types of creatures early on if they both exist. So those are the most common mistakes that I see with world building. I'm sure there are a ton more common mistakes, but I don't want to go on for too long. So I really hope you found this video helpful, and let me know if there are any mistakes that you see frequently in published books or unpublished books, if you have a writer's group or if you critique other people's work. This has been part of my novel bootcamp series. I will be making new videos 3 to 4 days per week throughout August. If you want to check out the workshops that are also part of Novel Bootcamp, I will put a link in the description. Happy writing, guys!